In this video you will learn the fundamental ideas of the Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian defense, a variation that is very easy to play and offers many opportunities to play for the win with black. After e4 black can respond with c5, the Sicilian defense. Now, a very common move for white is knight f3, developing the king's knight and taking control over the d4 square, preparing d4 to occupy the center with pawns. Black can respond with knight c6, developing his queen's knight and increasing control over the d4 square. White can play d4, occupying the center with his pawns. Black responds with c takes d4, eliminating the opponent's central pawn. After knight takes d4. Black can play knight f6, developing the king's knight and threatening to capture the e4 pawn. After knight c3, to defend the pawn, black can play e5. The Sveshnikov variation. This movement was already played in the 19th century. In 1950, the Argentine international master Jorge Pelican enriched the variation with new ideas. And around 1970 Grandmaster Yevgeny Sveshnikov improved the system and used it with great success. Therefore, the variation is named after him. Black places a pawn in the center and agrees to be left with a backward pawn in a weak d5 square, which means great structural damage, but in exchange he will be able to achieve a lot of activity for his pieces. In the Boleslavsky or Najorf variation, black ends up placing a pawn on e5, but with the disadvantage that his king's bishop is trapped within his own pawn chain, behind the d6 pawn. In the Sveshnikov variation, black quickly moves his pawn to e5, before moving d6, and will thus be able to develop his king's bishop outside the pawn chain, where it can be more active. The white knight is attacked and has to retreat. But the move knight b3 is not good, since black answers with bishop b4, taking his bishop outside the pawn chain. The knight on c3 is pinned, so the pawn on e4 is threatened and black has the advantage, as he is also prepared to make the liberating move d5. The move knight f5 is also not good, since black can play d5, attacking the pawn on e4 and freeing the action to the bishop on c8. After e takes d5. Bishop takes f5. d takes c6. b takes c6, black has a very good game. Knight takes c6 is not correct either. Since black plays b takes c6, reinforces his center and has a very good game. If white retreats his knight to the e2 square, black can simply play bishop c5, moving his bishop outside the pawn chain and black has a very good game. After e5, the best move for white is knight d to b5. Threatening to give check on the d6 square. d6. This move is necessary to prevent the white knight from invading the d6 square. So the f8 bishop is now trapped within its own pawn chain. Now, white basically has three reasonable options: knight d5, a4, or bishop g5. For example, in case of knight d5, white occupies a strong position in the center and threatens to check on the c7 square, which would gain material. Black can play knight takes d5, eliminating the opponent's central knight. After e takes d5. Black can play knight b8. And he will be able to recycle his knight through the d7 square. Black can continue with moves like a6, to force the opposing knight to retreat. He can continue with bishop e7, to castle on the kingside, and black will now be ready to advance with f5 and attack on the kingside. White can play a4, with the idea of controlling the b5 square. Black can play a6, to force the opponent's knight to retreat. After knight a3. Bishop g4, the white queen is attacked. After f3. Bishop e6. White can play bishop g5, developing the queen's bishop and pinning the f6 knight, to fight for control of the d5 square. Black can play bishop e7, to unpin the knight and prepare to castle. White can play bishop c4, completing the development of his minor pieces and increasing the pressure on the d5 square. Black can castle. And after bishop takes f6. Bishop takes f6. White can play knight d5, occupying the weak d5 square with his knight. Black can respond with bishop h4 check. After g3. Bishop g5. White can castle. And after king h8, black will be able to prepare the advance with g6 and f5 to attack on the kingside. White dominates the strong d5 square, but black retains the bishop pair and has very good attacking options. White can also make the move bishop g5, developing the queen's bishop and pinning the f6 knight, in order to increase control over the d5 square. Black can play a6, forcing the white knight to retreat. After knight a3. Black can play b5, a good move. Through black prevents the knight on a3 from being able to reactivate and approach the center. At the same time, he threatens to advance with b4, which would win a piece. This is the basic position of the Sveshnikov variation. Black's position is weakened, since the d5 square is weak and, in addition, white will be able to capture on f6 and leave the opponent with doubled pawns on the kingside. As compensation, black will be able to keep the pair of bishops. Furthermore, the white knight on a3 is very poorly placed and will have to lose several times to get back into the game. Therefore, black will be able to use these times to activate his game and deploy the full potential of his position. Now, white has two main options. Knight d5. And bishop takes f6. After knight d5, white places the knight on a strong square in the center and increases the pressure on the pinned knight on f6. The knight d5 move leads to calmer positions and more strategic positions than the bishop g5 move, which produces more tactical and complex positions. Black can play bishop e7, breaking the pin and threatening to capture the e4 pawn. If now white captures on e7, black can recapture with the knight. And after bishop takes f6, g takes f6. Black is ready to liberate his position with d5 and has a very good game. White can play bishop takes f6, the best move. White eliminates a good defender from the d5 square and keeps his strong central knight. After bishop takes f6. White can play c3, with the idea of maneuvering his knight to bring it closer to the center. Black can castle. After knight c2, white wants to move his knight closer to the center and, at the same time, free the way to advance with a4 and attack against the black pawns on the queenside. Black can play bishop g5, a typical move. Black relocates his bishop to activate it, since it was trapped with his own pawns. It will be able to eliminate the white knight when it reaches the e3 square. At the same time, it frees the way to be able to advance with f5 and attack against the e4 pawn. Instead of taking the knight directly to the d5 square, white can first take on f6. This is the main line. White's idea is to give up one of his bishops, to eliminate a good defender from the d5 square and at the same time weaken the opponent's pawn structure. Now, it is not possible to capture with the queen, since in case of queen takes f6, white plays knight d5. And after queen d8, white can play bishop takes b5, sacrificing his bishop and has a decisive attack. For example, after a takes b5. White plays knight takes b5, threatening to check on the c7 square. In case of queen a5 check. c3. It is not possible to capture the knight since black loses the queen. And in case of, for example, rook b8, white plays b4. And after queen d8, white follows knight b to c7 check. King d7. Queen g4 check. f5. Queen f5 checkmate. G takes f6. This move is forced. Black's pawn structure has been weakened on the king side and black has also lost an important defender of the d5 square. However, he retains the bishop pair and his position has a lot of potential. Now, the immediate threat is b4, which would attack the two white knights. White can play knight d5, anticipating the opponent's b4 advance and occupying a strong square in the center with the knight. Now, it would be a very serious mistake knight to e7, with the idea of attacking the opponent's knight in the center. Because white can play knight takes f6 checkmate. f5. Attacking against the e4 pawn, to eliminate the opponent's central pawn and remove support from the opposing knight. If the e4 pawn disappears, white will lose part of his control over the d5 square. White can play c3, typical move, with the idea of taking control over the d4 and b4 squares to limit the mobility of the black knight. At the same time, freeing the c2 square to improve his worst piece and move the a3 knight closer to the center. Now, it is not good to capture the e4 pawn, since after f you take e4. White sacrifices his bishop on b5 and wins. After the move c3, black can play bishop g7, developing the king's bishop and preparing to castle. After e takes f5. Bishop takes f5. Knight c2, white wants to move his knight closer to the center, since on a3 the knight is very passive. Black can castle. And after knight c to e3. The black bishop is attacked. Black can play bishop e6. The best square for the bishop. From this square it monitors the weakness of d5 and at the same time controls the f5 square and supports the advance with f5. Black can continue with moves like f5 and rook a7, with the idea of moving the rook towards the kingside. Black has a very good game. In the next video we will study a very instructive game in which we will see how black can take advantage of the full potential of his position.